The Mazda Millenia came with something no other luxury sedan of its era included, a section in the owner's manual explaining thermodynamic cycles. Not a warning, not maintenance. An actual explanation of why the engine in this car behaved differently from anything most buyers had ever driven. Mazda's engineers didn't just build the car, they had to explain it. Because without that explanation, it didn't make sense. So why did the Millenia need it, when no Lexus or Acura ever did? What kind of engine requires its buyers to read a thermodynamics lesson before they drive it home? And why did a car this thoroughly engineered almost completely disappear? The answers go back to 1991, when Mazda made a decision that made perfect sense at the time. It starts with what Toyota and Honda had already figured out 5 years earlier. Honda launched Acura in 1986. Toyota launched Lexus in 1989. The logic behind both decisions was the same, and it was brutally simple. Japanese manufacturers built excellent cars. Buyers knew it. But the mainstream badges, Honda, Toyota, Mazda, had a ceiling. Dealers could only charge so much for a car wearing those names, regardless of how well it was built. A separate luxury brand removed that ceiling entirely. Same engineering talent, same manufacturing capability, different badge, different dealership, different margin. Acura proved it worked. Lexus confirmed it. By 1989, the Lexus LS 400 was being reviewed alongside the Mercedes S-Class and winning on refinement. The ES 300 was pulling buyers away from entry-level European luxury at $30,000 and making Toyota look very smart for building a separate brand to do it. Mazda watched all of this and made the same call. The program was called Amati, announced publicly in 1991, with a planned model lineup that included a flagship sedan developed specifically to compete at the top of the near-luxury segment. Mazda didn't announce this quietly. Dealer recruitment for a separate Amati network had started. The model lineup was being revealed in the automotive press. Motor Trend and Car and Driver covered it. This was a public commitment, the kind you can't quietly walk back. Then Japan's post-bubble recession arrived. Through the early 1990s, the yen strengthened sharply against the dollar, compressing the export margins that Japanese manufacturers depended on. Mazda carried its own specific problems on top of the broader economic pressure. Production overcapacity at the Hiroshima complex and the weight of its supplier relationships had left the company financially exposed in ways that Toyota and Honda were not. Ford had held a minority stake in Mazda since 1979. As Mazda's financial position deteriorated, Ford increased its involvement. By around 1996, Ford's stake had grown to approximately 33%, with Ford executives installed in key management positions. The product planning priorities that came with Ford's control were straightforward. The 6, the 3, the MX-5. Volume products, mainstream segments, recoverable margins. A separate luxury sub-brand with its own dealer network and its own infrastructure was exactly the kind of investment Mazda could not fund in that condition. Amati was canceled. The public announcement became a public reversal, documented in the same automotive press that had covered the launch. But the flagship sedan that Amati was supposed to carry into battle was already built. The platform was specific to this vehicle. The engine inside the performance variant was unlike anything any competitor was offering. The assembly facility in Yamaguchi Prefecture was ready. So the car that was designed to launch a luxury brand got a Mazda badge instead, a Mazda price tag, and a spot in Mazda showrooms next to the 626. They called it the Millenia. And it arrived in North America in 1995, carrying engineering that the luxury segment had never seen before. The Millenia launched in North America in 1995. It was the only market it would ever be sold in. No European allocation. No Japanese domestic version. North America only, which tells you something about what this car was built to do and who it was built to defeat. The platform underneath it was called SGEA. That designation matters because it answers the first question critics raised the moment the Millenia arrived. Was this just a dressed-up 626? The answer is no, and the evidence is in the hardware. The SGEA was developed specifically for this vehicle. It was not borrowed from the mainstream 626 platform, not adapted, not shared. Mazda built a dedicated chassis for a car that was supposed to carry a luxury brand, and when that brand disappeared, they kept the chassis anyway. The front suspension is where the SGEA's luxury brief becomes visible in metal. Double wishbone geometry, front and rear independent multi-link. The 626 used McPherson struts up front, a cheaper and simpler arrangement that works perfectly well for a mainstream family sedan. The Millenia used double wishbones, two control arms defining the wheel's path through suspension travel instead of one, more precise geometry, more expensive to engineer, more expensive to manufacture. Mazda would not have put double wishbone front suspension in a 626. They put it in the Millenia because the Millenia was built to a luxury brief, and the brief required it. Assembly happened at the Hofu plant in Yamaguchi Prefecture, not at the main Hiroshima complex where Mazda's volume products were built. Hofu handled lower volume specialty production, and the Millenia's assignment there was a quiet acknowledgement of what the car actually was inside Mazda's own manufacturing organization. A specialty product, a low-volume vehicle, something that didn't fit the rhythm of the main plant's high-volume schedule. Two variants were available from launch. The base Millenia carried the KJ-ZE, a 2.5-liter naturally aspirated V6 producing approximately 170 horsepower. Conventional in construction, competitive in output, no exotic maintenance requirements. A capable engine that would carry the base model through 8 years of production without significant drama. Then there was the Millenia S. The S carried the KJ-ZEM, a 2.3-liter V6 that shared very little in character with the naturally aspirated unit below it in the range. The displacement was smaller, the output was higher. The engineering required to achieve that combination was unlike anything the segment had seen, and unlike anything any competitor in the near-luxury space was attempting. The Millenia S arrived at an MSRP of approximately $27,000 to $30,000, positioned directly against the Lexus ES 300, the Acura TL, and the Infiniti Y30. On paper, the positioning made sense. The price was right. The platform was purpose-built. The suspension was more sophisticated than most competitors in that range. A 5-speed automatic transmission, at a time when every rival was still operating with 4 speeds, gave the Millenia a genuine specification advantage that Mazda's press materials specifically called out at launch. But none of that was the reason anyone would remember this car. The reason was the engine in the Millenia S. An engine built around a thermodynamic principle invented for stationary industrial equipment. An engine so different in its operating character that Mazda made a decision no luxury automaker had ever made before. They explained it in the owner's manual. The Miller cycle is not a new idea. Ralph Miller, an American engineer, patented it in 1957. He designed it for stationary industrial equipment, gas compressors, power generators, equipment that runs at fixed speeds in controlled environments, not cars navigating traffic or climbing highway grades at variable throttle. The principle sat in industrial applications for decades before Mazda's engineers looked at it and saw something nobody else had seen. A way to extract more work from less displacement without sacrificing the output a luxury buyer expected. Here is what the Miller cycle actually does, and why it required explaining. In a conventional Otto cycle engine, the intake valve closes early in the compression stroke. The piston compresses whatever air entered the cylinder, combustion happens, the piston pushes down on the expansion stroke, and the cycle repeats. The compression stroke and the expansion stroke are roughly symmetrical. That symmetry is efficient enough for most purposes, but it leaves thermodynamic potential on the table. The Miller cycle breaks that symmetry deliberately. The intake valve closes later than it would in a conventional engine. The piston has already begun rising on the compression stroke before the intake valve seals the chamber. That late closing effectively shortens the compression stroke relative to the expansion stroke. The engine extracts more work from each combustion event because the expansion stroke is longer than the compression stroke. Thermodynamic efficiency improves. Combustion temperatures drop. The engine does more with less. The penalty is real and immediate. Less air enters the cylinder per cycle because the late closing intake valve allows some of the intake charge to push back out before the valve seals. Volumetric efficiency drops. Without a solution to that problem, a Miller cycle engine produces less power than a conventional engine of the same displacement, which is exactly where the Lysholm supercharger enters the picture. Alf Lysholm was a Swedish engineer who developed the twin-screw compressor in the 1930s for industrial refrigeration. Freezing plants. cold storage facilities. The twin-screw design uses two helical rotors meshing inside a housing to compress air in a continuous, smooth flow. No pressure pulses, no surging. The compression is even and constant in a way that the lobed rotors of a conventional Roots-type supercharger cannot match. Mazda chose the Lysholm design specifically because of that smooth delivery. The Miller Cycle's late intake valve closing requires precise intake timing. A supercharger producing pressure pulses at irregular intervals would interfere with that precision. The Lysholm's continuous compression is compatible with the Miller Cycle's geometry in a way that a conventional supercharger's design simply is not. The compressed air then passes through an intercooler before entering the intake manifold, reducing the temperature that compression heating creates and recovering the density advantage that heat would otherwise partially undo. The result of combining those three elements, Miller Cycle valve timing, Lysholm twin-screw forced induction, and intercooling, was an engine that produced approximately 210 horsepower from 2.3 liters of displacement. The Lexus ES 300 it competed against directly produced approximately 200 horsepower from 3.0 liters. More power from less displacement, with fuel economy competitive with larger naturally aspirated engines of the era. The engineering achievement is verifiable from both manufacturers' published specifications. But there was something the engineering couldn't fully hide. Below supercharger engagement, the Miller Cycle's late intake valve closing produces a throttle response that feels less immediate than a conventional naturally aspirated V6 at equivalent throttle positions. Period road tests from Car and Driver and Motor Trend documented it. Not a flaw, exactly. A characteristic. The engine behaves differently from what buyers in the near-luxury segment were used to, and different, in that showroom context, carried risk. Mazda knew this. The engineers understood that a buyer sitting in a Millenia S, feeling that hesitation below supercharger engagement, would assume something was wrong. They would bring the car to a dealer. They would generate warranty claims on a perfectly functional engine. And so Mazda did something no luxury automaker had done before or since. They wrote a multi-page technical explanation of the Miller Cycle's operating principle and put it in the owner's manual. How the intake valve works, what the supercharger compensates for, why the throttle feels different, and what that difference means. The owner's manual for a $30,000 luxury sedan contained a thermodynamics lesson. No Lexus ES 300 owner's manual explained combustion cycles. No Acura TL buyer needed to understand volumetric efficiency before driving home from the dealership. The Millenia S buyer did, and Mazda made sure they had what they needed to understand what they had bought. The engineering was real, the numbers were verified, the platform was purpose-built, the suspension was more sophisticated than the competition, the transmission had an extra gear nobody else was offering, and the engine produced more horsepower from less displacement with better efficiency than the Lexus it was priced against. None of it was enough. The Millenia S walked into North American showrooms in 1995 asking $30,000 and found itself standing next to the Lexus ES 300. Same price bracket, same front-wheel drive luxury sedan format, same target buyer. But the Lexus carried something the Millenia couldn't engineer its way into possessing. 6 years of brand trust, 6 years of carefully constructed luxury identity, built through a separate dealer network, separate marketing, and a deliberate separation from everything Toyota's mainstream badge represented. Buyers who walked into a Lexus dealership already believed they were buying luxury before they touched the door handle. Buyers who walked into a Mazda showroom were standing next to a 626. That context shaped everything. Acura had been building its reputation since 1986, 9 years by the time the Millenia arrived. Lexus had been building since 1989, 6 years of establishing that a Japanese manufacturer could deliver genuine luxury at a price point that made European competitors look expensive and overrated. The Millenia arrived in 1995 with none of that accumulated trust and all of the price expectations that trust was supposed to justify. Period road tests confirmed what the brand positioning couldn't absorb. Car and Driver and Motor Trend both noted the Miller Cycle's unusual power delivery character. The hesitation below supercharger engagement that Mazda had been careful enough to explain in the owner's manual was now being documented in national automotive press as a distinguishing characteristic of the car's driving experience. In a Lexus, a buyer who noticed something unfamiliar in the power delivery might assume the car was doing something sophisticated. In a Mazda, the same feeling raised a different question. The 5-speed automatic was a genuine advantage. Every competitor at that price point was still using 4 speeds in 1995, and Mazda's press materials called it out specifically because the extra ratio kept the Miller Cycle engine in its efficient operating range across more driving conditions. It was a real specification win. But Mazda had to explain why it mattered, because the badge wasn't doing the selling. Lexus didn't have to explain its 4-speed automatic. The badge handled the credibility before any specification sheet was consulted. Annual North American sales peaked somewhere in the range of 15,000 to 20,000 units. The Lexus ES 300 was not in that range. The gap wasn't close. The Millenia was competitive on paper and losing in showrooms, which is the specific combination that documents a brand problem rather than a product problem. The 1997 minor refresh told the same story in cosmetic terms. The front fascia was updated, the interior trim was revised. The mechanical specification was untouched because the mechanical specification was never the issue. The Miller Cycle engine carried forward unchanged. The Lysholm supercharger continued producing its smooth, continuous compression. The double wishbone suspension continued doing what double wishbone suspensions do. The engineers had nothing to fix. What the refresh was actually responding to was period criticism that the original Millenia's exterior design didn't read as luxury clearly enough when parked next to a Lexus in a comparison. The car that was supposed to be a luxury flagship, built to a luxury brief on a purpose-built platform with a genuinely innovative engine, was being asked to look more like what buyers already associated with luxury. So Mazda adjusted the fascia and updated the trim, and the underlying problem remained exactly where it had been before the first panel was changed. Ford's growing influence over Mazda's product planning through the mid to late 90s wasn't helping. The volume priorities were the 6, the 3, and the MX-5. The Millenia's niche didn't fit the strategy, and nobody inside the organization was going to fight very hard for a low-volume luxury sedan that was losing to Lexus year after year without a clear path to fixing the one thing that couldn't be fixed with engineering. By the time 2001 arrived, Mazda had been watching the Millenia lose to Lexus for 6 years, not catastrophically, not in a way that forced an emergency response, just steadily, consistently, year after year, in the way that a car loses when the product is sound, but the brand architecture underneath it isn't. The engineers had built something genuine. The market had decided it wasn't enough. And in 2001, Mazda made one more attempt to close that gap with the only tool still available to them. They changed how the car looked. The 2001 refresh was the most significant revision the Millenia received across its entire production run. The exterior got a larger grille opening. The front lighting was revised. Inside, the instrument cluster was updated and the trim was reworked to push harder toward the luxury feel that showroom comparisons with Lexus kept exposing as the car's weakest point. On paper, it was a meaningful update. In practice, it was an admission. The direction of the grille change tells the story more clearly than any press release could. The original Millenia's front fascia was restrained and distinctive. It had a coherence to it, a design language that felt considered rather than borrowed. The 2001 update moved away from that restraint towards something larger, more prominent, more conventionally luxurious in the way that buyers in Lexus and Acura showrooms had been conditioned to recognize as luxury. Mazda's documented reason was market feedback. Buyers standing in showrooms comparing the Millenia against the Lexus ES 300 didn't perceive the original design as sufficiently luxurious. So the grille got bigger. That change is the hardware evidence of a problem that had existed since 1993. The Amati cancellation left the Millenia without the brand identity that the car's design was originally built to represent. A luxury flagship for a luxury sub-brand can afford a restrained, distinctive front fascia because the badge above it is already communicating the message. A luxury flagship carrying a mainstream badge cannot. It needs the visual cues to do more of the work because the name on the trunk isn't doing any of it. The 2001 grille is what happens when a car spends 6 years trying to communicate luxury through a badge that was never designed for that conversation. What didn't change in 2001 is as significant as what did. The powertrain was untouched. the Miller Cycle engine carried forward without revision. The Lysholm supercharger, the intercooler, the 5-speed automatic, the double wishbone suspension, all of it remained exactly as it had been, because none of it had ever been the problem. The engineering was the part Mazda had gotten right from the beginning, and no amount of grille enlargement or interior trim revision was going to fix the part they hadn't. The 2001 refresh extended production to 2002. It committed to nothing beyond that. 2002 was the final year. No farewell edition, no successor announcement, no ceremony. The Millenia simply reached the end of its production run and stopped, leaving Mazda without a near-luxury sedan competitor and leaving the near-luxury segment without the only Miller Cycle engine it had ever seen. The Mazda 6 arrived in 2003 to cover the mid-size sedan territory. It was a good car, a mainstream car, priced below the Millenia, positioned without luxury ambition, aimed at the segment that actually fit Mazda's brand architecture, the 626 replacement rather than the Amati flagship replacement. The Millenia had no successor because the position it occupied, near luxury without a near luxury brand, was a position Mazda had decided correctly it couldn't sustain. What the cancellation of Amati and the discontinuation of the Millenia documented together was a decade-long attempt to enter the standalone luxury sedan market that produced exactly one vehicle across 8 years and left no lasting position in the segment. Toyota had Lexus, Honda had Acura, Mazda had tried and retreated. The accounting was that clean. What the Millenia left behind in the surviving fleet depends almost entirely on which engine is under the hood. The naturally aspirated base model survives without drama. The KJ-ZE is a conventional V6 with conventional maintenance requirements and no exotic components waiting to fail expensively. These cars age the way competent engineering ages, slowly and predictably, with the standard corrosion considerations that any Japanese export vehicle of the era carries in salt belt climates. Finding a clean base Millenia is a straightforward proposition. Keeping it running is not complicated. The Millenia S is a different calculation entirely. The Lysholm supercharger's rotor tip seals wear over time. That wear is progressive rather than sudden. The car doesn't announce the problem dramatically. It just gets slower, gradually, in the mid-range where the supercharger's contribution is most significant, in the part of the power band where the Miller Cycle's efficiency advantage lives. The symptom can be misread as normal Miller Cycle behavior, especially by owners who never experienced the car when the supercharger was delivering full pressure. A worn supercharger amplifies the low throttle hesitation that the engine has always had, making a maintenance problem look like a design characteristic to anyone who doesn't know what full boost feels like. Reconditioning the supercharger is not cheap. On a neglected example, the cost can approach the car's current market value. That economic reality creates a specific attrition pattern in the Millenia S population. Cars with worn superchargers and owners unwilling or unable to fund the repair simply stop being maintained. They disappear from the road not because the engine failed catastrophically, but because the repair math stopped working. What remains is sustained by a specialist community that shouldn't need to exist for a car that stopped production in 2002. Vendors who rebuild Lysholm units specifically for KJ-ZEM applications. Forum archives on millenia.net documenting supercharger reconditioning procedures, parts sourcing, intercooler condition checks, and the exact diagnostic steps required to distinguish a worn supercharger from a degraded intercooler, because both affect boost pressure through different failure paths and require different solutions. The fact that this business is sustainable tells you two things simultaneously. The supercharger fails often enough to generate consistent demand, and the people who own these cars invest in keeping them rather than walking away when the most expensive component wears out. That is not nothing. That is a community of owners who understand what they have. The Millenia's story is not really about a car that failed. It is about what happens when engineering and brand architecture operate independently of each other, and what the gap between them costs. The Lexus ES 300 produced less power from more displacement with lower thermal efficiency, roughly 200 horsepower from 3 liters in a conventional naturally aspirated configuration. The Millenia S produced approximately 210 horsepower from 2.3 liters through a thermodynamics cycle invented for industrial compressors and a supercharger descended from Swedish refrigeration engineering. the Millenia S did more with less. That is verifiable from both manufacturers' published specifications. It is not a marketing claim. And the Lexus outsold it by a margin that wasn't close. Every single year. The difference was not the car. It was the 6 years of accumulated brand trust that Lexus had been building since 1989, the separate dealerships, the deliberate distance from Toyota's mainstream identity, the careful construction of a luxury proposition that buyers accepted before they sat in the seat. When a Lexus buyer noticed something unfamiliar in the driving experience, they assumed the car was doing something sophisticated. When a Millenia buyer noticed the Miller Cycle's hesitation below supercharger engagement, they wondered if something was wrong. Mazda understood this. The owner's manual thermodynamics lesson is the evidence. The engineers were proud enough of what they had built to explain it in detail. They were also practical enough to know that unexplained unfamiliarity generates warranty claims, and that a buyer who doesn't understand why the throttle feels different will assume the car is broken. The explanation wasn't arrogance, it was necessity. The badge wasn't doing the trust-building work that Lexus's badge had spent years earning, so the owner's manual had to do it instead. That is the specific tragedy the Millenia documents. Not that the engineering was insufficient. The engineering was genuinely overbuilt for the market position it ended up occupying. A purpose-built platform with double wishbone suspension. A thermodynamic cycle nobody else in the passenger car segment had attempted. A supercharger design descended from 1930s industrial refrigeration because its smooth, continuous compression was the only design compatible with the Miller Cycle's precise intake timing. A 5-speed automatic when every competitor was still counting 4. An intercooler that the naturally aspirated version didn't need because the naturally aspirated version wasn't attempting any of this. All of it developed to the brief of a luxury flagship for a luxury brand, then sold without the brand. The Amati name never appeared on a single production vehicle. The infrastructure that Mazda publicly committed to building in 1991, the separate dealer network, the distinct brand identity, the deliberate separation from the mainstream Mazda proposition, none of it survived the financial pressure of the early 90s. What survived was the car itself, carrying the full engineering investment of a luxury flagship and the brand recognition of a family sedan, competing in a segment where the badge does half the selling before the test drive begins. The 2001 grille change is the most honest thing Mazda did in the Millenia's entire production run. It admitted, in sheet metal, that the original design could not communicate luxury without the brand it was designed to represent. It is the physical record of an 8-year argument between what the engineers built and what the market required, and the market won. What the Millenia demonstrates is something specific and worth sitting with. Engineering a thermodynamically sophisticated engine cannot substitute for the brand architecture required to sell luxury vehicles. The Miller Cycle worked. The Lysholm supercharger worked. The SGEA platform worked. The brand architecture didn't exist. And in the near-luxury segment, in the mid-90s, against Lexus, that absence was the only number that mattered. Go back to that owner's manual for a moment. Most luxury cars of that era came with a warranty card and a maintenance schedule. The Millenia S came with a thermodynamics lesson. Not because Mazda's engineers were showing off, because they had built something genuinely different, and they knew that different, without explanation, gets mistaken for broken. That honesty is the thing worth holding on to. The engineers understood exactly what they had made. They documented it carefully. They explained the valve timing, the supercharger's role, the reason the throttle felt the way it did. They put it in writing and handed it to every buyer. Not because the badge would carry the credibility, because the engineering had to speak for itself. A Lexus didn't need to explain anything. The brand had already done that work before the buyer sat down. The Millenia had to earn it on the page. What that means, decades later, is that the car left a record. The service manuals document the supercharger maintenance requirements in precise detail. The owner's manual explains the Miller cycle to anyone who opens it. The specialist community keeps the Lysholm units running on cars that stopped production in 2002. The engineering was built to last, and the documentation was built to last with it. That is what a time capsule looks like when engineers build it. Not a commemorative edition, not a farewell badge. A car whose paperwork tells the whole story of what it was trying to do, and why. If you remember the Millenia, or if you ever drove one when the supercharger was still delivering full pressure, let us know in the comments what it felt like. Now click on this next video to see another machine that was built beyond its moment. The Toyota Land Cruiser FJ40 is a crude steel box with no refinement and no luxury. Collectors are paying six figures for one anyway, because just like the Millenia, what matters is not what it looks like, it is what is underneath.